Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today to share with you my space story and how it has transformed me as an individual and a teacher. I hope you guys had a lovely lunch. I like to give interactive presentations, and so I really enjoy having you involved with the discussion. The first thing I want you to do is I want you to take a moment and turn to your neighbor and introduce yourself and tell them what you do. So we're going to take a moment, 1 minute, to do that. Okay, I want you to raise your hand when you're done, after you've shared what you do. Let's raise our hand. Once you've shared who you are and what you do, raise your hand. Okay, let's come back together and talk about analog astronaut and the future of education. How many of you heard the term analog astronaut before coming to this conference? Raise your hand if you heard. Oh, we've got one person right there who actually heard the term analog astronaut before now. I am an analog astronaut. What this basically means is I like to spend time living in Moon and Mars simulations here on Earth. I've lived in 3 Moon-Mars simulations, and I'm going into my 4th in January. But I haven't always been an analog astronaut, and I want to share with you my story of how I became this and how I now use space to inspire those within my reach. My space story goes way back in time and to the island of Guam. How many of you have been to Guam before? Raise your hand. Is there anybody in the room that's been? We've got a couple of people who've been to Guam. Now, this year, the United States celebrated a milestone in human space flight. How many in the room remember watching the Apollo 11 moon landing? Raise your hand if you watched it, and take a look around the room if you remember watching it on TV. That was in 1969, for those of you who don't remember that. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landing, and I like to think of myself as a celebration baby. I was born 8.5 months after Neil Armstrong took those famous steps on, on the moon, and the reason why I was born on Guam was because my father worked at the NASA tracking station located on Guam during the Apollo missions. So both me and my brother were born on Guam. Do we have any other celebration babies in here? Anybody? My father, pictured here, didn't have a college degree, but he had a love of mathematics. And at age 18, he was the youngest and first African American to be employed by the Electrodata Corporation as a technician working in electronic computation. Yep, at 18, that's how he ended up being at the NASA tracking station working on Guam for the Bendix Corporation later on because of his love for mathematics. I grew up in a household where my father had Neil Armstrong's autograph to him on the wall, along with other really amazing NASA memorabilia. Unfortunately, I will say that after I was born in 1970, just after Apollo 13, my parents left the beautiful tropical island of Guam, and my dad left NASA working as a contractor there, and we moved to Minnesota where my life in snow began. As a kid, I had a real love of aviation and aerospace. How many of you have seen the movie Top Gun? All right. How many of you wanted to be a military fighter pilot? And we've got a few of them in here. I grew up I just loved aviation when I was a kid, and Top Gun was one of the big things that helped fuel that. Another thing is, my parents were very supportive. How many of you have heard of the Civil Air Patrol? I was in it too, as a kid, yes. So my father, even though he was like, what, military aviation, he really supported it, and my parents every week would drive me to the Civil Air Patrol. And I always saw myself, when I was a kid, I was going to be an F-16, I was gonna go to the Air Force Academy, I was going to fly the F-16, pictured here, and then I was gonna transition into becoming the Space Shuttle Commander. Because how hard could that be, right? It'd be an easy thing to do as a kid. But two things transformed my life. The first one was I got glasses. And back in the 80s, you couldn't be a military aviator if you wore glasses. And the second thing that happened, which was unfortunate, is my father got cancer and passed away. And so I now found myself not really having a clearly defined path that I was going to go down. The one goal my father had for me and my siblings was for us to get that university degree that had eluded both him and my mom. Luckily, math and science came relatively easy for me. So even though my father passed away, I went off and I got my degrees. I got a degree from Edinburgh University in environmental science, and I got my master's and my PhD from Arizona State University in geology and science education. I spent a lot of time and money becoming Dr. Proctor, and it opened up doors that I never would have imagined when I was a kid. The first thing was that my education got me my dream job. I am a geoscience professor at South Mountain Community College in Phoenix, Arizona, and I just completed my 20th year teaching there. I've been fortunate as a geoscientist to be able to travel and teach around the world, and I even got my pilot's license. It was one of the things that after I got my PhD, I wanted to reward myself, and I had that love of aviation. So I went and I got my pilot's license. And a lot of people, don't worry, I'm not gonna be flying anybody around. I learned that it's easy to get your pilot's license, hard to maintain it because it's so expensive. Do we have any other pilots in the room? Oh yeah, at the back there. Hi, fellow pilot. When I began my teaching career 20 years ago at South Mountain Community College, I was a very traditional science teacher. And what I mean by that is I came through a very traditional science program growing up. One of the most interesting things is that during my entire education, K through PhD, I did not have a single black female science instructor. Not one in my entire science career. And so when I started teaching, I was very traditional in that lecture and lab, teaching my students about rocks and being able to identify geologic process through lecture and labs, and that model of being the disseminator of information from me to my students. Now, I also got the chance to teach some astronomy and some solar system stuff, but the astronaut program wasn't even on my radar. In fact, I didn't even know how NASA selected astronauts. How many of you know how NASA selects astronauts? It's really interesting because it didn't even cross my mind. But one of the questions I want to ask the room is, are you an A, B, or C? Take a moment, think about it, and then talk to your neighbor. Are you an A, a B, or C? Why or why not? So take a moment and talk to each other. Okay, let's come together. And who are my A's? Raise your hand high. Let's look around and see these A's. Look at the A's here, right there. I'm right there with you. I'm an A. Yeah, send me up, sign me up. I'm ready to go. Who are my B's? Okay, yep. Got to get paid, I understand. Show me the money. And then who are my C's? Look at all of those C's in the room, right? You're like, I'll keep my feet on the ground. And so I was an A, right? I had this love of aviation and aerospace when I was a kid. And all of a sudden, I wasn't thinking about that anymore. I was just doing my thing. I was a community college professor. I was traveling around the world. I was just really engaged in my life until one day, a friend in 2008 sent me an email that said, NASA's looking for astronauts, you should apply, with a link. And at first I was like, this must be a joke, right? I actually must have laughed out loud when that first came. But I opened up the link and I looked at the qualifications. And I realized that I was qualified for the astronaut program. I had a PhD. I had my pilot's license. I was scuba certified. I don't speak any Russian, although, but I had traveled and I taught around the world. But there was an issue. In my head, all I could think about is, I'm just a community college professor. They will never pick me. They will never pick me. That was the voice inside my head. Luckily, I also had my father's voice in my head, and it said, what are you talking about? Just apply. And so thinking about what my father would say to me made me think, oh, okay, I don't have anything. They might not pick me, but I got nothing to lose. I'm going to apply. And I did. In 2009, about 3,500 people applied for the astronaut selection process. From those, that 3,500, 2,800 were considered qualified. That means they met the minimum qualification I showed you on the previous page. From the qualified, NASA determined 450 that they considered to be highly qualified. And you got notified that you were highly qualified when they sent you a note in the mail saying they wanted you to take a Class 2 physical because you were now highly qualified for the astronaut program. But I realized that NASA was seriously looking at me when I was walking across my campus and the chair of my department stopped me and she said, someone from NASA keeps calling about you, wanting a reference check. His name is Melvin Leland Melvin. And I went, you mean Leland Melvin, the astronaut? And she said, well, I better get back to him then. And so I had made the 110, and I was invited to, thank you. I was invited to Johnson Space Center for a 3-day interview process. This was the photo we took of the first day. They bring you in groups of 10 or 11, and you go for 3 days. What do you think is the number one question I got asked when I first arrived at Johnson Center? The number one question, it's probably the same question that you've asked a lot of people here. It was an identity question. What do you do? Right? What do you do? How we identify ourselves comes up again and again in our lives. And think about it. How often have you asked that question since you've been here at the conference? I just asked you to ask that question to the person next to you. What do you do? In 2009, I found myself at Johnson Space Center surrounded by fighter pilots, doctors, MIT professors. And when they asked me, what do you do? I said, I'm just a community college professor from South Phoenix. I'm just a community college professor from South Phoenix. And in my head, what I heard following that statement was, what the heck am I doing here? When are they going to show me the door? So I had this amazing time meeting amazing people, but I was also convinced that they had made a mistake. How many of you have heard of impostor syndrome? Raise your hand. How many of you feel like you suffer from impostor syndrome and battle that? I am one of those people who battles with impostor syndrome. Even as I sit up here talking in front of you, I sometimes think, how did I get so lucky? What am I doing here? Some of you, when you look at this picture, if you can find me, the person to the left of me is Jessica Muir. She is currently on the International Space Station, and she is one of the 2 females who recently did the spacewalk, the all-female spacewalk. There's also another astronaut in that picture. And so after you go for these 3 days at Johnson Space Center and you're meeting astronauts and you're doing an interview, talk about an interview, you walk into this room and there's this big table with about 15 people around it and 10 of them are astronauts. And you're just like, okay, I got this. But what happens is you go home. You go home and you wait to find out if you're a finalist for the astronaut program. And that year, NASA was going to select 47 finalists. I still remember the day I got the call. It was early in the morning, and nobody calls me early in the morning except for my mother. And so when I answered it, I was like, yeah, hi. And all I heard was, hello, this is Johnson Space Center. And I started saying, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And she said, yes, we'd like to invite you back to Johnson Space Center. You're now a finalist for the astronaut program. Are you available to come in a couple of weeks? And I was like, I'm available to come tomorrow. Just send me the ticket. I'm out. I'm coming. And I found myself at Johnson Space Center again, surrounded by astronauts and doing all of these amazing tests and this crazy fun experience. But my identity was still so wrapped up in this traditional view of IQ and job title. Think about that. Who are astronauts? When we think about their qualifications, and here I kept saying to myself, but I'm just a community college professor. But that didn't matter because the experience that I was having was amazing. And they actually do a physical on every part of your body. And that picture there of the skull is actually me. Does it look like me? This way? And so I had this experience that I knew I could take back to my students regardless of the outcome. And so I went home and I waited. And I waited, and I waited. The application process in 2008, NASA opened up the application process, and you apply through the USA Jobs. It's just like applying to any other federal job. And then you go through this cycle. So the application had to be in by July 1st of 2008, and NASA went through this whole year-long process of weeding people down and doing interviews, and then finally they got to the top selection. And out of those 47 finalists, you wait for a yes-no phone call if you're not medically disqualified. And so I wasn't medically disqualified. They have to tell you if you are. And I was waiting. And then one day the phone rang, and it was Sunita Williams, and it was a no phone call. And I remember I was at Goddard Spaceflight Center the day that no phone call came. And I thought, they finally figured it out, that I am an imposter, that I didn't belong, even though I'd gone through this whole process. And I told myself, you know what? Next time I'm going to be better. And so I came up with a plan. I enrolled in a master's space studies program at University of North Dakota, even though I had a PhD. I was going to get my commercial pilot's license. I was going to get my advanced scuba certification, and I was going to learn Russian so that the next time I was not going to be an imposter. And then, after all of this pressure I was putting on myself, I stopped and I said, what am I doing? I was at a crossroads between this identity of myself and the life that I was living versus celebrating the fact that I had just made the top less than 1% in the NASA astronaut selection process. Out of thousands of people, I had gotten down to that 1% yes-no phone call. And so it made me think that maybe the narrative in my head was wrong. There must be more to me and my view of my identity than the narrative that I was using for myself. And so I decided to go to Mars. Are you an A, B, or C? Take a moment and chat with each other. Are you an A, B, and C? Why or why not? Would you go to Mars? Okay, raise your hand. Raise your hand if you're an A. Who are my A's? Oh, we just got a few of you that are like, I'll go to Mars. All right, who are my B's? Yeah, I know, same people as before. How much do I get paid? Yep, show me the money. And my C's? Most of the people in the room. So it's funny when you have interesting friends who think you will do all kinds of strange things. In 2012, another friend of mine sent me a Facebook post stating, NASA's looking for people to live in this new Mars simulation. It's to investigate food strategies for long-duration space flight. You love food and you love space, you should apply. These are my friends, right? But the thing is, I was like, I do love food and I do love space, so I applied. And the next thing I know, I was living in, well, I'll go back. This is the high seas habitat. How many of you have heard of the high seas? Some of you might have listened to the podcast about it. It pops up in a lot of interesting places when we're talking about going to Mars. NASA was looking at opening up, there's a lot of analog facilities around the world, and NASA was looking at starting a new one through the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and Cornell University. It was a joint partnership. And they had scouted this location on the Big Island of Hawaii to set up a Mars analog, and they were looking for people. And they put a shout out on Facebook and other places. They had a website for people to apply. And so out of hundreds of people, I ended up being selected to live in the first NASA-funded high seas mission. And it was this amazing international crew, and we were going to live in the high seas habitat for 120 days. That's 4 months. So now raise your hand if you could go to Mars on Earth for 4 months. Okay, look at that. You're like, it's Hawaii. You're like, I can do it. It's at 8,000 feet on the slopes of Mauna Loa. Now, how many of you could do 8 months? How about a year? How about 3 years? Because that's about the average that they're thinking for a Mars trip. 3 years, right there. We've got 1 person, 2 people. So when I lived in the Mars simulation, the high seas Mars simulation, that was really the first time that I started to reassess my identity of how I saw myself. And I started to think about human survival in extreme environments. Human survival in extreme environments. What does it take to survive on Mars? Take a moment and talk to each other. What does it take to survive on Mars? Go ahead. Try to come up with a couple of ideas of what it would take to survive on Mars. What do we need? Okay, let's come back together. All right, how many of you came up, your first idea was Matt Damon from The Martian? Raise your hand if you're like, well, of course, Mark Watney, right? That's all you need to survive on Mars. What I want you to do now is think about the character Mark Watney and all the skills, knowledge, and tools he had within him to survive in The Martian. Were those any of the things that you mentioned that you need to survive on Mars? I mean, you picked him. You might have said The Martian, Matt Damon, but why? Why? What was it? What were the skills? What were the knowledge? What were the things? And so when I Googled astronaut and qualities that NASA is looking for, there was this list. Take a look at this list and think about the way you described what it takes to survive on Mars. And were those some of the things that came up in your discussion? Adaptable, resilient, strong mental endurance, problem solver, team player. This is what NASA's looking in their astronauts. Curious, creative, sensitive, good communicator. Now, I want you to think about this as an educator. What if this had been your student? What if Mark Watney in this scenario existed, and this was your student? Wouldn't you be like, yeah, I taught him. That was my student. I'd be like taking all credit for that. I'd be like, yes, as a science instructor, isn't that what we want our students to have, this amazing list of qualities that puts them in situations where you know when their life, extreme survival, that they have the skill sets to be able to make it through those kinds of situations, whether it's in Mars or whether it's here on Earth, to have that. At the beginning of my career and talking about identity and going through the NASA astronaut selection process, and myself, when I identified myself and talked to people about what do I do, it was always from this idea of, well, I'm a professor, I'm a geoscientist, I'm a researcher, I'm an explorer, I'm an educator, I'm a mentor to my students, I'm a STEM communicator. These are words that I use to describe myself and my identity. And these are very, to some extent, quantifiable, right? We know how to measure whether you're a professor or a geoscientist or a researcher in these things. Easy for us to identify. But having, in the last 10 years, having transitioned into what you see before you now as an analog astronaut, this is now my identity. This is how I see myself. Some of these things, when you think about how do you measure resilience in a person, or that they're adaptable, or that they're a problem solver. Some of this requires experiential learning along with reflection to really understand how they apply to you. And that's one of the things that I learned was maybe this is what NASA was looking at when they almost selected me to be an astronaut. If I can see these things in myself, then maybe I can bring them out, develop them, nurture these things in my students. When I think about education and where do we need to go, I would love to see us talk more about identity in education and strip away these labels we use. Let's shift the conversation we have with our students and each other and reframe that. Some of you guys might have heard about this study that got a lot of play recently about what students want to be. What do you want to do when you grow up, kind of question. In the United States, YouTuber. How many of you heard about this? That they wanted to be a YouTuber in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in China, an astronaut. If you ask me, we're asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, what do you do, or what do you want to be when you grow up, let's ask, what challenges are you working on? And or what problem do you want to solve when you grow up? So let's take a moment, turn to that same person that you told that you said what it is that you do. Now let's reframe that question, and I want you to tell the person next to you, what problem are you trying to solve, that you want to solve in your lifetime? If you're a student, what problem do you want to tackle as you become older? Let's take a moment and talk about that. Yes, I'm going to come by and I'm going to pick on tables. How about this table here? Who wants to share?
Yes. Fix it, Deaf Ed funding in the state of New Mexico.
Dev Ed funding in the state of New Mexico. This is what you're working on solving, your problem. Thank you. Yes, give them a round of applause. Thank you. About how fast the room was chatting when I said, talk to the person next to you what it is that you want, what it is that you do. Everybody was chatting. When I switched the narrative and I said, what problem is it that you are working on solving right now? Or what problem is it that you want to solve? How many of you were like, I'm not quite sure. And if we don't know, as the adults in the room, how are our students going to know? How are we going to inspire them to take on some of these wicked challenges that we have coming down the pipeline? As a geoscientist, I have been fortunate to be able to travel around the world doing hands-on experiential learning. I was a PolarTREC teacher to Barrow, Alaska. Has anybody been to Barrow, Alaska? Do you know where Barrow, Alaska is? It is the northernmost city in the United States. It is the very tip of Alaska. And so I was there looking at coastal erosion and emergency services. I was a NOAA teacher at sea studying pollock and fish stock, the fish reserves in the Gulf of Alaska. Yeah, I know, that was a little weird one because I'm not a biologist. But, I learned so much about pollock. Had to look up what it was when I, from Phoenix to Alaska. And then I also, this past summer, actually in January, I found myself in India looking at urban sustainability. And then this past summer, I spent 2 months on the JOIDES Resolution drilling core samples for climate science, looking at past climate through these core samples in the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. What all of these experiences have in common is climate change. They were all about how our climate is changing and what we as scientists can learn and do about it. What I feel we need is students who identify with those same characteristics NASA wants in its astronauts. If we're going to take on some of these really tough challenges, don't we want people like Mark Watney? Don't we want students like that? So when I think about identity now, I think of it in these kinds of terms for my students. When I teach, I no longer teach geology. Don't tell my boss that. But I don't see myself as a geology instructor anymore. It's the learner identity I want to imprint on my students. I want to ask them to explain to me why being adaptable and resilient human is important in the context of geology. How can being curious and creative lead to geologic discoveries? Give me an example. I want them to think about these things in the context of geology. My learning identity is an innate part of me as a person, and I want it to be the same for my students. When all citizens are engaged and empowered by their learning environment, it prepares them to be active, creative, knowledgeable, and ethical participants in our globally connected society. I want to leave you with a task. Think about how you will answer, what do you do the next time someone asks you that? And are you satisfied with the answer? When people ask me that, now I say, I use space to inspire students to be analog astronauts who engage in humanity's quest to make our world a better place as we strive to boldly go beyond. Thank you.